Hey friends, Matt aka Martin here, and in this video I wanted to show you how I recreated Polyverse's wider plugin using only stock Ableton Live effects. If you don't know what Polyverse's wider plugin is, it's basically a free third-party plugin that allows you to add stereo width to any single sound, even if it doesn't already contain stereo width, and that stereo width that it adds is completely phase coherent, meaning that when the sound collapses back to mono, you don't lose any of the initial mono part of the signal. So without any further ado, let me show you how I recreated this plugin in Ableton Live. So first, in order to be able to actually recreate the plugin effectively, we need to understand how it works. And luckily, there's a really easy way that I figured out to kind of show you how this plugin is working. So here I just have basic white noise being fed out of Ableton Live's operator, which sounds like this. And on this track, we have a spectrum analyzer. And this spectrum analyzer is showing us the frequency spectrum balance of this sound. Because it's white noise, it is every single frequency at equal amplitudes across the entirety of the frequency spectrum in both the left channel and the right channel. And we can see obviously L and R together. And this is a completely mono sound, meaning that the sound that is coming out of the left speaker is exactly the same as the sound that is coming out of the right speaker. So now let's add Polyverse's wider to this sound, take a listen to what it sounds like, and then also take a look at what it looks like in the spectrum analyzer. So I'm going to add Polyverse's wider. Let's click and drag this before the spectrum analyzer. And so here is Polyverse's wider plugin. If you've never seen it before, it's very simple. We have this kind of width control in the center. There's a low bypass and a mono switch. This is the second version of it. So if you don't have the second version, you can go and grab that. It is free. But let's take a listen to what happens when I increase this stereo width control in the center. The sound gets really, really wide in the stereo field. And you'll also notice that if I click on this mono button, the sound stays completely mono compatible. There's no weird phasing issues or anything in mono. So if we take a look at this signal now in our spectrum analyzer, we can see that the spectrum analyzer is showing us the combination of the left channel and the right channel of audio. We can see that it is basically exactly the same as the signal was before we added wider. So this is the signal after wider. And if I turn off wider, that's the signal before wider. It's exactly the same in the combination of the left and the right channel. But now let's take a look at just the left and just the right channels, and you'll be able to see what's going on with this plugin. Let's turn on wider, and let's go back to this spectrum and change it so it's just viewing the left channel. Now what I'm going to do is turn down the width of wider all the way to 0% and take a look at this spectrum analyzer of the left channel as I increase the stereo width in wider. You can see now there's this series of kind of peaks and dips in the frequency spectrum. If we now take a look at this in the right channel, so this is in the left channel, and switch to the right channel, switch to the left channel, right channel, we can see that the peaks and dips in the frequency response shown in this spectrum are opposite between the left and the right channels. And what that means is that when the left and the right channels sum back together in mono, we get a completely phase coherent and completely accurate reproduction of the mono signal, because everything that's not occurring in the left channel is occurring in the right channel and vice versa. Now, this particular type of frequency response that we're seeing in the left channel and in the right channel is not quite the same, but it's very akin to what's called a comb filter. And if you don't know what a comb filter is, basically it's created by taking an exact duplicate of a signal, slightly delaying it, and then recombining those two versions of the signal. And what this results in is a series of harmonically related peaks and dips in the frequency spectrum. So in order to recreate wider, all we need to do is create a comb filter for for the left speaker, and then the opposite comb filter for the right speaker. Now, there are lots of different ways we can create a comb filter, but the most simple way is by using a delay. So what I'm actually going to do here, let's turn off Polyverse's wider, collapse this, and let's keep our spectrum analyzer open. And in order to create a comb filter, I'm going to add a delay. We're going to add this delay before the spectrum analyzer. And on this delay, I'm going to set it to 100% dry wet, turn the feedback all the way down, and turn off the filter. And now what I'm going to do is set the delay time so that it's not synced to our tempo. Instead, I'm going to set it so that it's in milliseconds so we can have a really short delay time. Now what we need to be able to do is hear the delayed version of the signal at the same time as the not delayed version of the signal. And in order to do this, I'm going to use a rack inside of Ableton Live, which allows me to split out a signal into parallel signal paths, one that will go through the delay and one that won't. In order to do this, I'm going to right click on the delay device title bar and select group. And now it's going to group this delay to what's called an audio effect rack. I'm going to open up the chain list. And now in this audio effect rack, I'm going to right click and create a chain. So now we have this noise signal running through the delay and running through the chain here, which doesn't have a delay on it. And take a listen to now what this sounds like. We're going to be able to hear basically two versions of the noise. It's going to sound kind of stuttery. But as I decrease the delay time, make it faster, you'll be able to hear this kind of comb filter effect. And if we take a look at this in our spectrum analyzer, we can see that it looks fairly similar to the frequency response that was shown in the left and right channels of wider. Cool, so now we've created a comb filter. How do we create the opposite comb filter? Well, the most simple way is to simply invert the polarity of the delayed version of the signal. I'm not going to go into why this works, but let me just show you that it does. So in order to do this, I'm going to add a utility device after the delay in my audio effect rack. And then on this utility device, I'm going to invert the polarity of both the left speaker and the right speaker. And now if we take a look at the spectrum analyzer of this comb filtered noise in the left and the right channels, we can see where the peaks and the dips in this frequency response are. Now if I turn off the utility, take a look at where the peaks and dips in this frequency response now lie. You'll see that the dips fall where the peaks are and the peaks fall where the dips are. Turn it back on, turn it off, turn it back on. Awesome. So now all we need to do is have a version of this where we have the left speaker that has one comb filter and the right speaker that has the inverted polarity version of that comb filter. Now, there are a few different ways to do this. You could simply just engage the utility control here and just invert the polarity of one of these sides if you so wish. So for example, I could just uninvert the polarity of the right speaker, and now we have effectively a version of wider. We have a really wide sound, and if we look at the spectrum analyzer, in the left channel we can see one comb filter, and in the right channel we can see the inverted version of that comb filter. And the two sides combined in the left and the right channel result in basically the exact same white noise. And so now, in order to control the amount of stereo width, all we actually need to do is just turn either up or down the delayed version of the signal to either increase or decrease the intensity or the strength of the comb filtering applied. You'll see that if I turn down the gain of this utility, we're basically just left with the initial signal. And then as I increase the gain of this utility, we're going to start getting a wider and wider sound. Now, one thing that you'll notice with this approach, though, is that it doesn't automatically kind of change the positioning of the comb filter like it does in wider. As we increase the width in wider, the kind of positions of those peaks and dips in our frequency response changed, but here we don't have that kind of automatically happen. Instead, the position of those peaks and dips are actually controlled by the delay time in this delay. So as I either increase or decrease the delay time of this delay, the peaks and dips in the frequency response change in the left and the right channel. So if I go to the left channel of the spectrum analyzer and start to play around with the delay time, we can now see that comb filter effect moving across our frequency spectrum. And actually, I really like the ability to kind of tune this comb filter as opposed to just having it arbitrarily chosen for me in wider. However, if you want to have this comb filter tuned to whatever width control you also have, you can totally do that as well by just controlling this with a macro control of a rack. Speaking of a rack, now let's actually turn this into an Ableton Live rack so that we can save it and control it and add it as our own preset. And by the way, this rack that I'm about to create is something you can actually download as part of my utility racks, which you can grab over on my Buy Me a Coffee page. Also, if you're liking this video so far, make sure to leave a like down below, subscribe if you're new, and now let's get to seeing how we can actually rack this up into something that resembles Polyverse's wider plugin. So firstly, let's open up our macro controls here. Now we need something to be able to control the width of the device, and this is going to be the gain of the utility. You can also have the volume of the delayed chain in the chain list. It's kind of totally over to you, but I'm going to use the gain of the utility here. Right click on the gain, map it to macro 1. And now to stop us from being able to kind of overdo this too much, I'm going to click on this map button and just change the range of the gain control here from -infinity to 0, as opposed from -infinity to +35, because I really don't want to be adding 35 decibels of gain to this delayed version of the signal. By the way, if you don't know how racks work, I'll leave a link to a video up above that explains all about audio racks and instrument racks and MIDI racks in Ableton Live. So make sure to go and check that out after this video if you have no idea about what racks do in Ableton Live and how they work. So now let's leave our mapping mode. Let's change our gain all the way down to -infinity. And now I need a control to control the tone of that comb filter. So I'm going to right click on the delay time and map that to macro 2. And we're going to now again adjust the kind of range of the delay time here so that it doesn't go all the way up to 5 seconds, because that's not going to create a comb filter as we heard before. Instead, let's go to our mapping again, and I'm going to set the maximum time to maybe kind of 12-ish or 11 or so milliseconds. Let's set it to 12 milliseconds. And now let's increase the gain control so we can hear all the effects of this. Let's go out of our mapping mode, and now as we adjust this kind of L time or tone control, we can hear the tonality of this stereo width changing. Cool, and so now we have control over the width and the tonality of this width. I can just rename this macro control here to width, and I can rename this to tonality or just tone. And now what I'm going to do is actually just hide all of these other macros with this plus and minus controls. So minus, minus, minus until we just see these width and tone controls. But now we need to add those other controls of wider that we had before, as well as just kind of like an additional control or two that I think are really useful for this type of device. So in order to do this, we now actually have to process the entirety of the signal. So we're going to actually group this whole rack into another audio effect rack. So I'm going to right click on this audio effect rack here and go to group. And now we've created a way that we can process the combination of the delayed signal and the undelayed signal using something like a utility to control things like the mono check, and another effect that we can use to control the low cut or low bypass that we can find in wider as well. So because we don't need to see anything else that's going on in this middle audio effect rack at the moment, I'm going to close up the chain list, and now we're going to add a utility, and this utility we're going to use to check the mono compatibility. The easiest way that we can do that is by just mapping a macro control to control the mono control of this utility device here. So first, let's open up our macro controls of this new audio effect rack. Let's map our width control of this first rack here to the macro 1. Let's map the tone control to macro 2. And now we can map this mono control to one of the other macros here, but I'm actually going to leave a few of these macros just unused so that I can add some other stuff in. Firstly, I'm actually going to add another utility device here, and I want a way to be able to kind of further increase the stereo width of this signal without having to kind of then increase the gain of that delayed version of the signal that we created before. And the way I'm going to do this is now by using the width control in this first utility. So I'm going to right click on this width control, map this to macro 3. And now as I increase this stereo width control, what this is actually doing is just turning up the side signal, which is the difference between the left and the right channels that are going through this particular audio effect rack or going through this particular utility device. And what this allows us to do is just add a little bit more or extra stereo width to the sound. So as I play this white noise, let's increase the stereo width control. And that's just increasing the side part of the signal. And this is still retaining mono compatibility. So if I go to this second utility and turn on this mono control, that's what it sounded like without everything. And that's what it sounds like with everything. It's a little bit louder now, of course. But now because it's a little bit louder, I want a way that I can control the output gain of this signal. So instead what I'm going to do is map this gain control of our final utility here as our final control. And I'm actually going to map this to macro 6 because we're only going to use 6 macros. Now I'm going to map this mono control here to macro 5. So we have now this macro 5 controlling the mono on or off. This is our kind of mono check. And lastly, what we need to be able to do in order to replicate wider, which as we can see here has a low bypass, which just allows us to bypass the effect of this stereo width for any frequencies below a certain frequency. I'm actually going to use a mid-side EQ. There's another way you could do this simply by using the bass mono feature of this second utility here. But if this doesn't give us the entirety of the flexibility of the frequency range like we get in wider from 20 Hertz all the way to 20 kilohertz. In order to do this, I'm just going to add an EQ8 after this first utility here. I'm going to turn off all of these EQ nodes and switch our mode to mid-side. Going to switch to the side signal, turn off these EQ nodes, and just engage the first one, which is a high pass filter. And now we can just map the frequency of this high pass filter to macro 4 by right clicking, mapping to macro 4. And now we get a way of turning down or turning off the side signal below a certain frequency, which allows us to keep the low frequencies completely mono and not add any stereo width to them, which sometimes you kind of want to do in a mixing context for various reasons. In order to be able to turn this off, I'm also going to map the device activator of this EQ to that same macro by right-clicking, mapping it to that one frequency B macro. And now we're going to go into our audio effect rack main, go to our mapping controls, and here I can now adjust the ranges of each of these different controls. So for the stereo width control here, I'm actually going to have this go from 100% to 200%. I don't want it to go all the way to 400%. It's going to get really loud if I do that. And now for this EQ8 device on, I'm going to start with a minimum of 1 and set the maximum to 0. And now what this is going to do is when that macro control is all the way down at the bottom, it's going to turn off that EQ. And now when it's anything other than at the bottom of that macro, it's going to turn on that EQ as we start to increase this frequency of this filter. If we want to be really proper, we can also set the frequency control of this filter from 20 Hertz all the way up to 20,000 Hertz. And I'm going to also set this output gain control here to have a maximum of 0 dB with a minimum of -infinity. Again, I'm not using this to increase the level of the signal after the fact. I'm just using it to decrease the level of the signal after the fact. And so now if we go out of our mapping mode, we can collapse all of these different effects in here. We can show only our first 6 macros. And now we have an Ableton Live rack that somewhat simulates the effects of Polyverse's Wider. Let's take a listen to this on a few different sound sources. So here's the version of Wider that you get in the utility rack. It's slightly different. It uses a slightly different method, but it's very similar to what I showed in this video. And here it is on some white noise. Let's take a listen on some vocals. On a percussion hi-hat loop. and on a full-on drum break. There you have it. There is my version of Wider using only stock Ableton Live plugins. Of course, it doesn't work exactly the same as Polyverse's Wider, but I think it's pretty cool, and I think it adds some slightly different features that I find really useful. If you want to download this as well as a bunch of other cool racks, you can find it as part of my utility racks over on my Buy Me a Coffee. Otherwise, check out this video here to learn some more cool stuff about Ableton Live. I hope you liked this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you all in the next video.